I know you would be disappointed if we didn't actually get to the program. So welcome and thank you for joining us for our fourth and final Thursday night out of the season. My name is Nicholas Cassis, and I'm an associate rector here at Trinity-by-the-Cove. Tonight, we are honored to be joined by Dr. Yehezkel Landau, who has been active in interfaith relations and Israeli-Palestinian peace building for over 40 years. Dr. Landau will be drawing on his extensive experience to speak on the topic of interfaith peace building among Jews, Christians, and Muslims. His talk will begin with some reflections on holistic peacemaking, then focus on his work with Open House as a case study, and finally consider how the principles and praxis of that micro laboratory could be applied at the macro political level. We are so very thankful that he has agreed to be with us tonight. Before we get started, I'd like to thank Alex Vance, Rusty Troth, and Bruce McKever, who are on the committee that organizes the speaker series and who arranged for Dr. Landau to be here tonight. The overarching theme of this year's speaker series is pluralism and civil discourse. And each speaker in the series has given us a different angle on the topic. Dr. Landau's work in this area moves from the theoretical to the practical work of peace building in the midst of disagreement and conflict. So I'm particularly excited for the opportunity to learn from him tonight. Before we get started, just a few quick words on the format. We will be recording this talk and we'll make it available on our website after the event for those who couldn't make it tonight, or if you'd like to revisit the talk afterwards. Also, if you have any questions as we're going through the talk, feel free to jot them down on your placemat or on your napkin or something, or just keep them in mind. And then at the end, we'll have 10 to 20 minutes for questions and answers. So I'll be running around with a microphone so that both our speaker and everyone else can hear you. If you haven't, I see a lot of you have sort of been rushing to finish, but you don't have to finish your dinners yet. You can keep on eating, enjoy yourself while we continue the speaker's talk, just to fit it all in. Without further ado, let me call on Bruce McKever to introduce our speaker.
Good evening. Hi, Yehezkel. Good to see you. Yeah, Yehezkel's a good friend and he's an advisor to my foundation. It's an honor to have him speak with us this evening. He's an expert on interfaith affairs. He's someone who has lived the greater part of his adult life trying to reconcile the religious differences between the great faiths. But he does this from a deep understanding of his faith and those he is teaching and counseling on. He's got a BA magna cum laude from Harvard in 1971, followed by an MTS from Harvard Divinity School in 1976. He got his doctorate of ministry with distinction from the Harvard Seminary in 2013. Yehezkel has an interesting background. I was talking with him this afternoon. He was born in Santiago, Chile, where his father was a representative of MGM Films. I want to hear more about that sometime. His parents grew up in Vienna, Austria, and fled the Nazis before the war, came through Panama and then into New York where they met. And his father was in World War II out in Guadalcanal in the Army. And then when they discovered his skills in German, he became part of the intelligence community and on the team for the landing at D-Day. They came back to New York for Yehezkel to graduate valedictorian of his class in high school and captain of his tennis team. That was enough to get him into Harvard, where he started as a biology major and later switched to psychology and became very interested in religion. He was a distinguished student, but tells me his most overriding memory from college was the famous Harvard-Yale game that was tied 29-29 in 1969. I was actually there, but I didn't see that game yet. So I was in Cambridge the same year. But I was across the river. That's sort of a different land. He became more religious and entered Harvard Divinity School, where he studied under Niebuhr and Christopher Sindall. He began a dream journal at some point and discovered he had a longing for deepening his Jewish faith tradition. He became involved in the religious peace movement and left to live in Israel. He became deeply involved in the politics and the running and uniting of two Jewish peace movements there. I'm not going to murder the names of those things. I'm going to let Yehezkel tell those. But they mean path of peace and strength and peace. These were dovish movements that here he has practical knowledge and hands-on in peace building and community building. From 2002 to 16, he came back to the US and became a professor of Jewish tradition and interfaith relations at Hartford Seminary, where he held the chair of Abrahamic partnerships and directed the building of Abrahamic partnerships, a training program for Jews, Christians, and Muslims. Today, he lectures on interfaith relations and Mideast peace issues. He's co-edited a book called Voices from Jerusalem, Jews and Christians Reflect on the Holy Land, and has authored innumerable journal articles. I don't think we could have a better person talk to us tonight about interfaith, what's going on in Israel and Palestine. It's sort of been put in the background, but it's really heating up again. We're at a crisis point, and it's been put in the background with the war in Ukraine. Anyway, I find Yehezkel is a very wise man. I think I consider him my rabbi. So anyway, God bless you, Yehezkel. Tell us about what's going on over there.
Well, many thanks, Bruce, for your gracious introduction. And thank you, Father Nicholas, and the whole parish community at Trinity-by-the-Cove for welcoming me into your midst, at least virtually, at the tail end of Lent. Now, just to give you the Hebrew names of the two branches of this combined religious peace movement in Israel, Palestine, on the Jewish side, it's Oz v'Shalom, strength and peace from Psalm 29, and Nitivot Shalom, paths of peace from the book of Proverbs. And this movement has, first of all, tried to make peace among Jews, which is at least as difficult, if not more, than between Israel and Palestine, on the secular left and on the religious right. And these two Jewish camps within Israeli society have different visions of what a Jewish state ought to mean. And so to reconcile them on the way to making peace with Palestine is an arduous challenge, and it's consumed my adult life, as you just heard, for over 40 years. So I want to start by saying that I self-identify as a human being. And in saying that, I try to balance my particularistic Jewishness with my universalist identity as a member of humanity. For me, interfaith engagement is a spiritual practice that expands my intellectual horizons and nourishes my connection with the divine. We're on the cusp of Christian Holy Week and the week-long Jewish festival of Passover. In fact, the Passover Seder, a week from tonight, falls on Good Friday. And both of our spring festivals fall within the Muslim holy month of Ramadan, which began at the beginning of this week. The convergence of sacred calendars is a threefold blessing, inspiring us all to make our fasting, feasting, and prayers springboards for collective action in the service of inclusive justice and genuine peace. With the cruel war raging in Ukraine and ongoing conflicts in other parts of the world, including the Middle East, we know how high the stakes are. We need to work together as people of faith and as instruments of God's justice and peace to transform conflicts before they cause additional suffering, and ideally to prevent violent conflicts from erupting in the first place. So in this spirit, I offer my thoughts to you this evening. And as Father Nicholas indicated, what I have to say is divided into 3 segments, and each one about 10 minutes or less. And then I hope we'll have an open conversation. And I invite you to ask any questions about the Middle East, about Judaism, Jewish belief and practice, anything that's on your mind, not just restricted to what I'm about to share with you. So my first segment I call a holistic approach to peacemaking. Politicians and diplomats who try to resolve armed conflicts usually focus their efforts on achieving a pragmatic exchange of benefits between the warring parties. They aim for a compromise on the tangible issues in dispute, whether territory or resources or political power. Such a straightforward approach to conflict resolution is understandable, but it often fails because deeper aspects of the conflict, psychological, emotional, and spiritual dimensions, are ignored or downplayed. At the same time, many peace movements attempting to transform violent conflicts into constructive partnerships also fail in their efforts because they focus most of their energy and their rhetoric on protesting against injustices or abuses of power. This prophetic stance of decrying misguided policies is a natural and I would say even necessary approach to peacemaking, but it is far from sufficient to shift the underlying dynamics in long-standing conflicts. A more holistic approach to peacemaking, one that takes more time but holds more promise for ultimate success, addresses various dimensions simultaneously. First, on the pragmatic political level, compromises need to be negotiated on the disputed issues. These usually require tangible concessions on both sides, and political leaders need to acknowledge that these renunciations entail painful sacrifices for the different parties. Culturally appropriate symbolic expressions of collective grief have to be used while implementing the terms of the agreement. Economic incentives are usually a vital part of peace treaties so that ordinary citizens can experience some so-called peace dividend that improves their quality of life. This aspect of peacemaking is the one that is normally adopted by diplomats and politicians, but to focus only on this dimension of any conflict risks an outcome that is politically expedient in the short term, but is not truly transformative or healing. The agreement may easily unravel when political circumstances change. For example, when new leaders come to power. If the populations in conflict don't experience some cathartic, therapeutic shift in their attitudes and feelings. Hence the need to incorporate the other dimensions of peacemaking, which I will now outline. On the cognitive level, new thought patterns need to be encouraged among the opposing parties. In prolonged conflicts, attitudes crystallize into ideologies that become integral to the identities on all sides. Victim scripts are often constructed to justify belligerent views of oneself and the other, and the need for a defined enemy perceived as a threat hardens over time into an us versus them worldview. I see sad instances of this coming out of the mouths of Russian leaders, including President Putin. the capacity for moral discernment or conscience becomes skewed to the point where two double standards of justice are adopted, rather than one inclusive understanding of justice encompassing both ends and means. Typically, the other side's position is viewed as illegitimate, and its militant actions are considered aggression or even terrorism, while one's own side's position is considered righteous, and its actions are deemed necessary acts of self-defense. Now, to shift from this dualistic and antagonistic frame of mind, role-playing or simulation exercises that encourage people to take the adversary's perspective can help them gradually develop a dual or multi-narrative perspective. If competing narratives are held in tension rather than seen as mutually exclusive, a combatant on either side may reach the point where she or he can think and say, oh, if I were on the other side, I would be fighting me too. This is one crucial element in developing empathy, but it still lacks the necessary element of emotional intelligence, which I'll now address. So on the emotional level, intense feelings that keep both parties locked in what I call antagonistic interdependence need to be transformed if the conflict is to be truly healed and closure achieved. This is the pastoral or priestly approach to peace building that needs to complement the prophetic critique of official policies. This approach aims at achieving a cathartic transformation of the emotional matrix that fuels the conflict at its deepest level for individuals and for collectives. Here are what I consider the essential challenges confronting the emotionally intelligent peacemaker. How can we transform fear to trust, especially in situations of ongoing insecurity? How can we help people work through their feelings of anger, even rage, to the point where they can forgive the other side and ask them for forgiveness in return? And how can people who are crippled by grief, how can they be helped to extend that emotional response to include compassion for the suffering on the other side too? Fear, anger, and grief are the powerful forces driving most conflicts. They are irrational in nature, and so they are not susceptible to reasoned arguments, which is why peacemakers need some basic psychological training, or at least the ability to ally with mental health professionals. And finally, on the spiritual level, a different understanding of holiness has to be cultivated. And here, religious leaders and educators need to set an example for others. In the monotheistic traditions, God is viewed as sovereign over all creation, thereby relativizing all claims to territory and power. In the context of Israel-Palestine, for example, that means that no one nation can claim exclusive sovereignty over the whole land. Instead, the land belongs to God, as we're taught in Exodus 19, verses 5 and 6. For all the land is mine, ki li kol haaretz, and you shall be unto me a kingdom of priests and a holy people. That's just before the 10 Commandments are revealed. So the land belongs to God, as does everything in creation, and by the grace of God and under certain moral conditions, both Israelis and Palestinians belong to that land. This spiritual truth is obscured by competing nationalisms, which are, by definition, self-referencing and self-preferencing. To transcend such narrow partisanship, a shared vision of what it means to be partners in consecration, hallowing both time and territory, has to be developed and articulated by religious leaders, Jews, Christians, Muslims, Druze, and others, Baha'is included, all of them in the land called holy, are hungry for an inclusive experience of genuine holiness. And on such a spiritual foundation, a new and liberating politics could be fashioned. So now I want to focus on this case study that Father Nicholas alluded to, and this micro laboratory for testing these ideas and practices that I just described is called Open House, which is a house at number 1 Klausner Street in the mixed Jewish-Arab city of Ramleh between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. And Open House, I consider to be a center of healing and hope in the middle of a war zone. Here's the brief story. The house was built by a Muslim family named Al-Khairi in 1936. In July of 1948, during the first Arab-Israeli War, what we Israelis call the War of Independence and the Palestinians call their national catastrophe, Al-Nakba, the Al-Khairis were expelled at gunpoint from their home and ended up on Palestine Street in the West Bank city of El Bira next to Ramallah. About 90% of the Christian and Muslim Palestinians living in Ramleh at the time were forced out when the Israeli military took over the city in July of 1948, leaving a lot of empty homes. In November of that year, some 50,000 Bulgarian Jews, including my former wife, Dalia, who was an infant, less than a year old at the time, moved from Bulgaria to Israel, and many of them were settled by the government in the empty homes of Palestinian refugee families. And so Dalia Ashkenazi, now Dalia Landau, and her parents and 2 aunts were placed in the Al-Khairis' home. And for 19 years, she did not know who had lived there, wondering all the time, how did we get to this house and whose was it before we arrived? So after the 6-Day War or the June War in 1967, the Al-Khairi family returned from the West Bank to see their home in Ramleh. And Dalia welcomed Bashir Al-Khairi and 2 of his cousins when they came and knocked on the door. And she basically felt, oh, I've been waiting for these folks all these years, my whole life. And now they have finally appeared. And so a relationship developed between the 2 families, having this shared home. And out of that relationship, after Dalia inherited the home, when her parents had died, and we were by then married, we met Bashir Al-Khairi in Ramallah, actually at the home of an Anglican priest, the late Audi Rantisi and his British wife, Patricia. And I'll never forget that lunch where we broke bread together and said blessings over the food. An Anglican couple, a Jewish couple, Dalia and myself, and Bashir Al-Khairi, a Muslim. And out of that conversation came a shared commitment to dedicate this site to 2 objectives: to create an affirmative action nursery school for Palestinian Israeli children who had no opportunities to learn in their own language and culture before kindergarten. So it was an affirmative action Head Start program, to use an American term. So we created what we called the Center for the Development of the Arab Child. And Dalia and I honored Bashir's wishes in doing that. And in addition, we wanted to create a place where Jewish and Arab together, Jewish and Arab children, teenagers and adults could meet and overcome their misunderstandings. You may or may not know that in most of Israel, Jews and Arabs go to separate schools. There are very few integrated schools, a handful. Both communities are culturally conservative and fear cultural imperialism or encroachment from the other side. So up to now, this dual school system, all administered by the Israeli Ministry of Education, has been the norm. So behind this initiative, which is now, what shall I say? It's 31 years old. There is an approach to peace building based on 3 A's: acknowledgement, apology, and amends. Acknowledgement of harm done to the other side, and that's a shift in cognitive awareness as well as conscience. Sincere apology, expressions of remorse for that harm, and that's the moral and spiritual act of repentance, which both sides need to embrace, difficult as it is. And practical amends, walking the talk, practicing what we profess for the suffering that was caused. And that's active compassion and acts of restorative justice. And I believe that if such a micro model of peacemaking at the grassroots level were translated to the macro political level, then Israelis and Palestinians would experience unimagined breakthroughs in their relationship that would usher in, God willing, inshallah, Bezrat Hashem, a new era of mutual solidarity and cooperation. So that's a reflection based on the experience at Open House. And more generally, if you would like to explore more deeply this terrible tragedy, it's a tragedy. It's a conflict between 2 rights. It's not a morality play between right and wrong or oppressors and oppressed. It's 2 oppressed and traumatized peoples trying to live together in a tiny country the size of New Jersey. If you'd like to explore this local or regional conflict with global ramifications, including here, where we have imported some of the toxicity from the Middle East, and it afflicts our relationships in America, and we can talk about that soon during the Q&A. I recommend this discussion guide that my partner Joyce Friedman and I co-wrote, called How to Talk to Just About Anyone About Israel-Palestine, First Steps Toward Meaningful Dialogue. And you can download this at no cost at the website for Joyce's nonprofit, which is My Brother from Another Mother, all one word, no spaces, mybrotherfromanothermother.org. And I commend that to you. Okay. So in the last part of my remarks, I want to shift back from this case study called Open House to the general challenge of transforming conflict on the macro political or societal level. In recent decades, we've seen some amazing examples of conflict transformation in places like Northern Ireland, where I've been 2 or 3 times, South Africa, where I've yet to go, but the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and its work shepherded by the recently departed Anglican Archbishop Desmond Tutu, and in Australia, where several years ago, the government of Prime Minister Kevin Rudd acknowledged and apologized for the mistreatment of the indigenous peoples of Australia when the white Europeans from England came and decimated them. These are 3 macro examples of amazing transformation. I wanted to add also the nonviolent implosion of the former Soviet Union, but we see revisionist history in the making in a very cruel way right now, courtesy of Vladimir Putin. So let's think about what all this would mean for America, right here in the United States. Now, 2 of the factors, primary factors that engender and exacerbate conflict here in our country are religion and race. They often intersect, making the challenge of healing relationships between groups more difficult. And there's an additional complicating factor, and that's the intra-communal disputes that cause division and strife within communities of faith or within racial and ethnic communities. In this section of Matthew's gospel that is called the Beatitudes, Jesus declares, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God." If we aspire to live up to this sacred vocation of peacemaking, we need to embrace the 3 A's, acknowledgement, apology, and amends, that undergird the peace-building work of Open House in Ramla. First, we need to speak confessional truth, not self-serving propaganda, and acknowledge that throughout our country's history, we have privileged one racial group as well as one gender above others. And in fact, we've codified in our legal system and in our social relationships hierarchical and discriminatory practices that violate the principles and the values we profess, including the idea of liberty and justice for all enshrined in our Pledge of Allegiance. Once we can speak truthfully in our public and private arenas of discourse, we then need to demonstrate remorse and genuine repentance for those discriminatory practices and policies by making amends for this tragic history. That is, we need to agree on actions that promote restorative justice as the foundation for a more just and inclusive society. We need both bottom-up and top-down remedies for our endemic social pathologies. We need to elect more empathetic and compassionate political leaders, and at the same time, we need to work with our neighbors and our local communities to build bridges between estranged groups. I support projects that bring different people together for a common goal, like a Habitat for Humanity construction project that has members of different religious and ethnic communities building a home for a needy family. In the course of the build, the participants can come to know one another up close and gradually overcome conditioned stereotypes and prejudices. I speak from personal experience because when I taught at Hartford Seminary, I participated in a series of 3 educational gatherings at a synagogue, a church, and a mosque designed for the people working on a local habitat site so that they could learn more about each other's religious and cultural backgrounds. Well, I hope I planted some seeds for further thought, discussion, and action. And so now I welcome your reactions, and I wish all of you a festive Holy Week and Easter season. Okay, now the fun part for me, I get to hear you and what's on your hearts and minds.
All right, thank you so much. Lots for us to think about and to digest.
I don't hear you, Father Nicholas. Are you talking?
Okay, now I am. Can you hear me again?
Yes, now I can hear you.
Sorry, I just turned off the mic.
Okay.
Both of them. Dr. Landau, first of all, thank you very much. By my casual observation, religious spirit, religious faith, even a sense that it exists at all, is at a very low ebb in American politics and governance. Do you feel the same, if you agree with that, do you feel the same way about Israeli politics and governance and about Arab politics and governance?
I don't think I would endorse that description in any of the arenas you're now describing, not in this country and not in the Holy Land or the Middle East. Here, well, in the Middle East, religion is not purely a private affair. There isn't a First Amendment disestablishing any official religion. There are deep histories there, which in some cases fuel tribalism and nationalism or ethnocentrism. Here I'm thinking of Oh, Jerry Falwell, the moral majority, very active evangelical movements, evangelical Protestant movements. So they affect politics, and they vote in or out political leaders and propositions on a ballot. So I think this is a deeply religious society, including in our politics, even though officially no religion is in charge, thanks to the Disestablishment Clause of the First Amendment. But it's not like secularized Europe at all, where at most you have Christian democratic parties, so-called. But even in Sweden, the Lutheran Church is now not an official governmental entity. So, but maybe there's a deeper point. What is your name? The questioner.
Bob.
Bob?
Yes, it's Bob.
Okay, let's say I don't agree with your premise, but where would you like to take the conversation?
The reason that I put the premise is that much of what you talked about, which I'm intrigued by, I'm hopeful for, and I see promise, revolves around a sense of shared values and faith in spiritual guidance and inspiration. And I take your points about the United States and the evangelical movement, which is basically a shadow of itself today. But at the bigger point, which I'm trying to get at, is I don't see a penetrating sense of spiritual awareness of spiritual guidance and hope in this country. I'm hoping that we can find that somehow, and that the Israeli government and people and politics and the Arab governments and politics and people can also find that same source of inspiration.
Well, I would say amen to your prayerful hope there. In this country, all of the movements for expanded civil rights, especially the movement in the 60s, led by Dr. King and others, or even today, William Barber and others, are religious, prophetic, and pastoral witnesses. They're bearing witness to our deepest faith convictions. So, and they have spiritual and moral influence. Not enough. But the question is, to what extent they can overcome the special interests that spend millions of dollars lobbying our elected representatives, so that their consciences, rather than their campaign expenditures, will dictate how they vote and how they lead. Well, thanks, Bob. Anybody else?
Yehezkel, can you hear me? This is
Yes.
Bruce.
Hi, Bruce.
Tell us something about what is going on now in Israel. It's really been overshadowed by the Ukrainian situation, but I think we're at a very perilous moment in time. And can you tell us your take on it? I know you've probably recently been there. I don't know what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I was back there for 2 weeks in July and 10 days in November. Well, it's pretty precarious now. I was talking about the threefold blessing of having Ramadan, Christian Holy Week, and Passover all converging. At the same time, for religious militants, that is an added incentive to attack the other side and wreak havoc. And right now, there is another wave of terror attacks within Israel, which is making people very anxious and putting pressure on the government and the police to prevent or preempt such attacks. There was one in Tel Aviv just a few hours ago. And I had to call my son and daughter-in-law who live with my one-year-old granddaughter in Givatayim next to Tel Aviv to tell them to stay indoors because the gunman in that case, who had killed 2 people and wounded others on the main street, Dizengoff Street in Tel Aviv, was on the loose and the police were trying to find him, and Givatayim is not far away from there. In fact, my daughter-in-law hadn't even heard that this had happened until I texted her. Then I'm sure she turned on the TV to see the news. So at this very time, when there is this wave of violence, once again, the government, I won't go into great detail, but the government is in its most precarious state since it was created about a year ago to replace, finally, Prime Minister Netanyahu and his right-wing government, which had been in power for some 12 years. They just lost their 2-seat majority out of the 120 members of the parliament, the Israeli Knesset. They had 61 to 59 for the opposition, which is led still by Netanyahu while he's under criminal indictment for fraud and breach of trust. So one of the right-wing members of the present coalition government, which I should say spans, this is the most inclusive government Israel has ever had since it was founded in 1948. It has right-wing and left-wing Jewish parties, as well as centrist parties, and it has an Israeli-Palestinian Islamist party, 4 members of this party, which that's the first time Arabs have ever been, Israeli Palestinians, Arab citizens of Israel have ever been the Israeli government. It was one of Prime Minister Bennett's own party members on the religious right, a woman named Idit Silman, who defected, who just announced that she's leaving the coalition and she's going over to the Netanyahu side, the opposition. So it's now 60-60, and you can imagine that Bibi Netanyahu and his colleagues are trying to find one more defector to bring down the government and force new elections, which would be the 5th election in 3 years. And probably with the same, more or less the same outcome, which is a tie and lack of stability. But we'll see. It's, I suggest that if you can, pay attention to what's going on there when you have a few moments between your cries of anguish over what's happening in Ukraine.
See another one over here.
Thank you for your lifetime of very dedicated work on behalf of humanity. How do you see the transition right now occurring from those like you and those around you that have been doing a lifetime of work into the age grouping of people that are, say, 15 years old to maybe about 30 years of age? How do you see that transition being able to carry on the efforts that all of you have put forth?
That's an excellent question. And you need to ask somebody who's an expert in social media for that, because that's where it's at for that generation. And we have to be creative, inventive, imaginative in creating social media platforms and the content for those platforms that would inspire young people to think more broadly, out of the box, wider angle lenses on their perception, and certainly not to see the world in binary or dualistic terms of us versus them. For example, just telling the stories of peacemakers locally and internationally, so people can be inspired and will think, oh, I can do that too. If that person can succeed, then I should give it a try, right? The real challenge is cynicism and despair. So that's where religious actors, including clergy, have to step into the breach and say, no, that's not who we are, essentially, as children of God, and not succumb to disillusionment, disenchantment, and hopelessness. So that's my short answer. I don't spend enough time with teenagers anymore, and so I'm really not a social media person. I am neither on Facebook nor Twitter. So you should ask my son, who's technically savvy and is a website designer, how to use the internet as an educational counterweight to the political contamination that is polluting our hearts and minds.
Actually, I see a question here from Jay, but whoa, saw a question here from Jay, but I have a quick follow-up. Sometimes you referenced telling the stories of peacemakers, and those are inspiring, and I think a lot of the younger generation can identify with them as role models, almost unreachable goals, right? You're thinking of, you talk about Martin Luther King Jr. or Desmond Tutu. These are just unreachable kind of figures, which is one of the reasons why your particular work with Open House, where it's an individual making an individual choice in their own life, in their own circumstance, is often so, we don't hear those stories, but that's such a powerful story. And it's not just, I don't think, a microcosm for a larger application, but it's also just how we should, it's a great way of living, just thinking about, we don't have to change the whole world all at once. We can change things in our own individual community. I would love to hear more about that personal story, but maybe we'll get there, but let's get to this question first.
Father Nicholas.
Yes.
If 1 second, if you just allow me, if the Open House story, the little snippet that I shared with you, whets your appetite for more, you're curious, I recommend this book by Sandy Tolan called The Lemon Tree, subtitled An Arab, a Jew, in the Heart of the Middle East. This is the Open House story. It's a chronicle of two families and one house, one shared home, standing for two peoples and one shared homeland, the Lemon Tree. And if you want to get a little more historical, more general, you can check out this book, which is called Side by Side, Parallel Histories of Israel-Palestine. For
Awesome.
the next generation, we need textbooks in schools that tell side by side on adjacent pages the kind of the Israeli or Zionist consensus narrative and the Palestinian national consensus narrative. So both of these can be validated before they get accommodated. If you rule the other one out, you call it wrong, illegitimate, not worth validating. That's where the propaganda machine spills forth all kinds of self-serving information. And then the other narrative becomes like the dark side of the moon, which we never see. And of course, the security barrier, the wall that is now snaking down the center of Israel-Palestine, is not helping at all. That was built because of the terror attacks of the second Palestinian uprising, the second Intifada. But I hope, like the Berlin Wall, it will come down very soon as an outcome of a genuine peace building process. Okay, yes, you said somebody else had something to say.
Yes, thank you. You said something earlier about thinking outside the box and also the propaganda machine. So you perhaps love the focus of my next question.
What's your name? What's your name?
Jay.
Jay, go ahead, Jay.
Trump took a little different approach during his administration to the Arab-Israeli problems. And I wanted to get your take on that approach. You know, he was able to move the embassy. He also, I think, did put together some sort of an Arab coalition, which it still exists and I understand still meets. And then in addition, unrelated to that, I did hear that there were some specific movements among the Arabs to do economic development in Sinai and other efforts to kind of work on this problem. And I wondered if you could just make any comments that might come to you on that.
Yeah, yes, I can comment on that. The 4 years of the Trump administration did not sow the seeds of mutual understanding and cooperation. I'm sorry to say, at least between Israelis and Palestinians, Trump and Netanyahu were kindred spirits, are still kindred spirits in many ways. Okay, I'll leave it at that, except to say maybe they could write their memoirs together in a jail cell. Once, you know, Bibi Netanyahu is now under indictment in 3 cases of corruption. And I don't have to tell you about January 6, 2021 and the big lie and what's going on in this country. So the so-called Abraham Accords, which created mutual recognition between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan, okay, in addition to the peace treaties that Israel has with Egypt and Jordan. So that expanded the outer circle of Arab neighbors or regional partners. And just a few days ago, 4 or 5 days ago, Israeli Foreign Minister Yair Lapid hosted a summit in the Negev town of Sde Boker, where David and Paula Ben-Gurion are buried, which was, I think, a praiseworthy initiative. The problem is the Palestinians are left out and they become more angry, enraged by everybody's neglect of their issues and concerns. Now, the Palestinians are themselves co-responsible for their how the world, including other regional actors, view them. They have their own tragic political history where they have been assassinating each other back from the 1920s, where the Husseinis and Nasrashibis were killing each other. So now you have Hamas, Islamist movement running the Gaza Strip, and you have a secular nationalist movement, the Fatah movement within the PLO, running the West Bank. How these two factions can come together to share power is an internal challenge for them. And if you'll permit me, in about 45 seconds, I can give you a kind of, what shall I say? This is wishful thinking. This is looking ahead and saying, okay, what would the map look like after a peace agreement? I would imagine, with courageous and visionary leadership on all sides, a majority Jewish state called Israel with 20% Palestinian national minority, which is the case today within Israel, within the pre-67 boundaries, with a federated Palestine with two provinces or two states like Connecticut and Florida with a small s, the West Bank and Gaza federated in a state of Palestine with its capital in East Jerusalem, and a third entity, the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, in a confederation like the Benelux nations, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg in Western Europe. But instead of Benelux, it would be called Isfalur, Israel, Palestine, Urdun, the second in Arabic, the second and third in Arabic. And I think that's more realistic than what people describe as a so-called two-state solution. I don't use the word solution. This is not a problem to be solved. This is a tragedy to be healed and redeemed over time, over at least a generation, step by step, as trust is built and tested. And I don't think two states are enough. And even Palestine may not be one inclusive state. I think it may be just federated as two autonomous entities. That's for the Palestinians to work out. So that, and I can even tell you, I can give you a scenario for how this might be negotiated if the leaderships on both sides in Israel and Palestine would change. If we Israelis, if we were to elect a, let's say, a far-sighted, realistic, compassionate prime minister, and I'm thinking of somebody like Ami Ayalon, who used to head the Shin Bet Security Service, the Internal Security Service, and moved to the left, and even created back in 2004, I think, a peace initiative with the Palestinian leader, the former president of Al-Quds University, a friend of mine, colleague of mine, Sari Nusseibeh. They created a movement. If he, let's say, were elected prime minister, and the way F.W. de Klerk negotiated with Nelson Mandela, of blessed memory, both of them, when he was in prison in Robben Island after 27 years of incarceration, if somebody like Ami Ayalon could discreetly, at the beginning, secretly negotiate with political prisoner number one for Israel, who is the Palestinian leader, Marwan Barghouti, who has the unique capacity to actually bring together Hamas and Fatah elements. He did that when he forged an agreement among prisoners, political prisoners from these two camps, Fatah and Hamas. So if the Israeli prime minister, Ami Ayalon or somebody else, could work this out with Barghouti and then release him from jail, the way de Klerk did with Mandela, I think within a short time, we would be on the way to healing this toxic relationship. So I say all this because I am hopeful in the long run, truly. But I'm pessimistic in the short run because of where we're stuck. We are really stuck, which is why we need third parties like the United States or the European Union and Egypt and Jordan to help bring the Israelis and Palestinians back to the negotiating table. Okay, other people have.
We're just about at time, but let me see if there's a couple more questions.
Okay.
Dr. Landau has graciously agreed to go a little over if we have a couple questions.
I'm so sorry to pull along, but I appreciate your forthrightness and your oversight of this whole issue. And my name is Hank, by the way. I think from my perspective, and I only visited Israel for a short period of time, but mainly in the Jewish sectors. I'm just wondering whether you detect on the ground in Israel, there are these small points of light, like President Bush's 1,000 points of light groups who are of a like mind. I say this only in the context that I think in actuality, many Americans believe something very much as you propose, very forthrightly, but have the impossibility from their own circumstances to express that desire for some type of reconciliation. I'm just asking if there are other block parties and other open houses and other people on the streets, both in Israel and on the other side of the wall, that are beginning to discuss this. Maybe it is the youth, as is suggested, but do you have an optimism in that regard? Long question, sorry.
Yeah, I don't use optimism or pessimism. I'm a faithful realist. And I'm hopeful again in the longer term, partly because of these macro transformations in places like Northern Ireland or Southern Africa. There's no reason we can't see a similar transformation in Israel, Palestine. There are, to answer your question directly, there are scores of grassroots peace initiatives throughout Israel and some cross-border initiatives, even with the wall there, between Israelis and Palestinians. You may or may not know that the Congress of America, US Congress, recently approved and allocated funds, millions of dollars, for cross-border Israeli-Palestinian initiatives, social and economic undertakings. So this is something really positive. I'll confess to you, one of the reasons I moved back to the United States, aside from personal and professional family reasons, was to try to influence American foreign policy in the region, because I don't think America has used its power very wisely a good part of the time. And I think we, people of faith, need to create a Jewish, Christian, Muslim alliance for the healing of the Holy Land. And we can do that here more effectively than can be done there because of the political pollution that, pollutes our spirituality there. So thank you, Hank.
And maybe that does point, oh, this is not working, is it? Maybe that
I hear you
does-
faintly.
Yeah. I was just going to say, maybe that does point to that short-term pessimism, but long-term optimism, where it's not easy work, but it's something that is accomplishable, something that we can actually make some progress towards. Well, I want to be respectful of everyone's time. So thank you so much, Dr. Landau, for being with us today. Thank you for all of your wise words. This has been wonderful, stimulating conversation. Hope you've all enjoyed. Just a reminder for those who are here next week, we will not be meeting doing our normal Thursday event, because we'll have Maundy Thursday. And then the week after that, we have our Shorts and Steel Drums event. So we'll have one more even song dinner and formation at the end of the month. Before we go, I'd love to offer a word of prayer. Let us pray. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who is good and does good. Look as a Father upon all nations and kindreds and peoples and tongues, and let the barriers which separate us be broken down, that we may grow in concord. This we pray in your most holy name. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you all very much, and thank you again, Dr. Landau.
Thank you all again for welcoming me virtually into your midst, and I hope to show up in person, God willing,
That would be
soon.
wonderful. Thank you.